My parents humiliated me in front of 30 guests at their anniversary dinner, smiling as they announced a family trip to Hawaii, then casually informed me I wasn't invited because I'd be staying behind to babysit. 30 witnesses to the moment I realized I wasn't a daughter, I was unpaid labor. My chest burned, my hands shook, and something inside finally snapped. What they didn't know was I'd been building an escape for years and decided to use it now. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My name is Wendy Dixon, and I'm telling you this from Carmel by the Sea, California. With salt air in my lungs and a kind of quiet in my chest I didn't know was possible. But 3 weeks ago, I was still in suburban Boston, standing in my parents' living room with a dirty dessert plate in my hands. 30 people staring at me and my own father saying, "You're not part of this trip, Wendy. Someone has to stay behind and take care of the kids." Like he was assigning a chore, not erasing a daughter. And the crazy part is I actually smiled because when you've been trained your whole life to stay pleasant while you're being used, your face learns the mask before your brain catches up. But inside I felt that old familiar sensation, like I'd swallowed ice and it was melting into my stomach, because it wasn't just the words, it was the timing, the public nature of it, the way my mother's mouth tightened in that satisfied little way, like she'd been waiting for this moment to put me back where she thought I belonged. And I could tell by the way my sister Megan didn't even look surprised that this had been decided long before I asked about the flight time. Which means what happened at that dinner wasn't a slip, it was policy, it was the Dixon family job description for me, finally being read aloud in front of witnesses. And I want you to understand exactly what that job looked like before we get to what I did next, because if you've ever been the reliable one, the easy one, the one everyone counts on because you never make a scene, you're going to recognize this like a bruise you forgot you had until someone presses it. The Dixons live in a white colonial house in a Boston suburb where every lawn is cut like a military haircut and every mailbox looks like it belongs in a catalog. And my mother Patricia treats that neighborhood like a stage where the only acceptable emotion is "we're doing great." She's never had a paid job, but she runs her social image like a full-time career. Church committees, fundraisers, neighborhood gossip disguised as concern. And my father, Harold, used to be a branch manager at a regional bank, which sounds respectable until you realize he's the kind of man who confuses being quiet with being good. Like if he doesn't raise his voice, he can pretend he isn't participating. And then there's Megan, 3 years younger than me, the kind of pretty that gets forgiven for things before she even does them. Married to Derek Hartley, corporate attorney, the name my mother says like it's a title she personally earned, and they have 2 kids, Oliver and Sophie, and everyone in that house revolves around them like their needs are gravity. In my family, the hierarchy isn't spoken. It's implied in the tiny humiliations you learn to accept so early you stop even noticing them. Like the driveway situation, Megan's Lexus gets the prime spot every time because guests notice what's in the driveway first. And my Honda Civic gets pushed to the street like an embarrassment, and I moved it every time without complaint because that's what the invisible one does. She adjusts, she shrinks, she makes the picture look nicer. When guests came over, my mother introduced Megan with an upgrade. "This is my daughter Megan. Her husband Derek is a partner at Whitmore and Associates." Even when he wasn't a partner yet, she said it like prophecy. And then she gestured at me like a side note. "This is Wendy. She helps out. Not Wendy the accountant, not Wendy with a degree, not Wendy with a brain, just Wendy the extra set of hands." And the thing about helping out in families like mine is that it's never occasional. It's a role you get assigned and then punished for if you try to resign. Thanksgiving meant I arrived at 6 in the morning to start the turkey because my mother said she couldn't trust anyone else to do it right, and then she would immediately leave me alone with a list of side dishes like I was a catering assistant. And Megan would show up at noon in some soft, expensive sweater, kiss my mother on the cheek, and sit down like a guest of honor while I was still in the kitchen wiping counters. And when the meal was over, I washed my mother's Wedgwood china, the set I was not allowed to use, only allowed to clean. And if that sounds small, good, it's supposed to sound small because the whole system is built on small things that add up until you wake up one day and realize your life is basically a series of unpaid shifts. Christmas was the same circus with tinsel, plus wrapping the gifts my mother bought because her arthritis was acting up, which was fascinating because her arthritis somehow never interfered with bridge 3 times a week or the way she could grip a wine glass for 2 hours while she held court in the living room. Birthday parties for the kids meant I was entertainment coordinator, cleanup crew, and emergency babysitter while Megan got a break like she'd run a marathon and Derek would hand me the kids like he was passing off luggage. Hey, can you take them? We need to mingle. No please, no thanks, just assumption. And every time I wanted to object, my brain would flash a warning like a car dashboard. Don't, because in families like mine, the moment you stop being useful, you start being called selfish. I work part-time as an accountant, mostly remote clients, flexible hours, modest income. The kind of job my mother dismisses with a smile because it doesn't impress her friends. But that flexibility became the excuse for everything. You can do it, Wendy, your schedule is flexible, which is a cute way of saying your time doesn't count because we can take it whenever we want, and I used to half believe it. I used to think maybe they were right, maybe my life really wasn't important enough to protect. And I hate admitting that because it makes me sound pathetic. But that's the psychological trick. They don't just use your labor. They convince you your needs are optional. Then 3 years ago, my personal life fell apart in a way that should have broken me, and honestly almost did. I'd been dating a man named Kevin for 4 years, the kind of relationship that drifts into, we'll probably get married without anyone saying it out loud. And one night he sat me down and said, I love you, Wendy, but I don't think I'm in love with you anymore. And then he delivered the line that burrowed into my brain like a parasite. You're just there. You're always just there. And I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it was too accurate, because that's how my family had always treated me, like a background object, and suddenly it felt like my whole identity was present but not chosen. After he left, I did something impulsive for the first time in my adult life. I wandered into a pawn shop downtown and I saw a used Canon DSLR camera tagged at $180. And I bought it with money I should have saved. And I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want my mother's voice in my head saying, why would you need that? Like the fact that I wanted something was a moral failing. That camera became my secret and my mirror because I started photographing the people everyone ignores. Elderly women waiting at bus stops, overnight janitors with tired eyes, street vendors with calloused hands, people the world looks through like glass. And as I shot those images, I started to notice the common thread. Invisibility isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about being surrounded by people who benefit from not seeing you. And I called the series Invisible Women. And I made an anonymous Instagram account, no face, no real name, just the photos. And over 3 years, it grew to 12,000 followers. 12,000 strangers who saw what I saw, and every time someone commented, this made me feel seen, I felt something shift inside me because I wasn't crazy, I wasn't too sensitive, I wasn't imagining the way certain people get erased. I kept the camera wrapped in a cashmere scarf at the back of my closet like it was contraband. Not because it was shameful, but because it was mine, and in my family, mine was never treated as valid unless it served them. Then, 3 weeks before my parents' anniversary dinner, I got an email from a gallery in Monterey, California, Coastal-like gallery, and I almost deleted it because I'm trained to expect disappointment, trained to treat opportunity like it's suspicious. But it was real. The owner wanted to talk about my work, and I stared at that email for 20 minutes with my hand shaking. And still I didn't reply right away, because the part of me that grew up in the Dixon house believes good things get revoked the moment you admit you want them. The only person in my family who actually saw me was my Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, the one my mother calls the family disappointment because she never married and moved to Carmel by the sea 20 years ago to open a cafe with a pottery studio in the back. And my mother hates her for it because Ruth's life is proof that you can choose yourself and still be okay. And my mother cannot tolerate evidence that undermines her worldview. So she mocks Ruth's clay hobby like it's a cautionary tale. But I've been calling Ruth every Sunday night for 7 years in secret because she's the only relative who talks to me like my thoughts matter. And when I finally sent her one photograph to test the waters, she replied, Wendy, this is extraordinary. You have a gift. And I cried so hard I had to sit on the floor because nobody had ever called anything I did extraordinary, not once. Not in that house full of achievements that only counted if Megan did them. Ruth was the one who admitted she'd sent my Instagram to a gallery owner she knew, Marcus Coleman. And that was the gallery that emailed me, and she said, You don't need anyone's permission to pursue what you love. And I replied to Marcus that night, which means when my father stood up at that anniversary dinner and announced Hawaii, I wasn't just Wendy the helper anymore. I was a woman with a door quietly opening on the other side of the country, and they had no idea. The anniversary party itself was exactly what you'd expect. A performance, 30 guests, catered menu that I assisted with to save money, which is hilarious because the Dixons will spend a fortune to look impressive, but will squeeze free labor out of me like it's a sport. And the week before the party, I took 3 days off from my accounting clients to set up. I ordered white roses and peonies because my mother specified them like she was ordering a magazine shoot. I wrote 60 place cards. In calligraphy because she insisted. I polished Waterford crystal. I coordinated the caterer. And on the day of the party, I arrived at 7 a.m. in jeans and a t-shirt because I'd be in the kitchen for 10 hours. And by 6 p.m. the house looked perfect. Candles everywhere, the long table set for 30 with my mother's finest china. And I changed into a simple black dress because I've learned that looking too good in my mother's house is a crime. She caught me in the hallway and said, "Is that what you're wearing?" And when I said it was appropriate, she nodded like granting me permission to exist. Just stay in the background. "Today is about your father and me," and I nodded because I always nodded. Megan arrived, perfectly timed for maximum attention, in a red designer wrap dress. Derek behind her, kids dressed like catalog models. My mother practically levitated with pride, introducing Derek's job title like it was a hymn. And at one point a guest actually asked me if I worked for the catering company while I was holding a tray of appetizers. And my mother floated over and said, "Oh, that's Wendy. My other daughter. She's helping out tonight. My other daughter, like a spare, like an extra. Battery you keep in a drawer." I spent most of the evening managing the kids in the kitchen while Megan and Derek mingled. And when dessert came out, I realized I hadn't eaten all day and nobody saved me a plate, which is so symbolic it almost makes me laugh now. Because of course they didn't. Feeding me was never part of the plan. My function is to serve. Then at 9 p.m., my father tapped his champagne glass and made his big speech about 40 years of marriage and building this family. And my mother beamed, and Megan squeezed Derek's hand like she was in a commercial. And my father said, "To celebrate, we're taking the whole family to Hawaii next week, 1 week at the Four Seasons in Maui." And everyone clapped and murmured, and Megan squealed. And I felt this stupid little hope lift in my chest, because even after everything, part of me still wanted to believe I could be included without earning it through labor. And I took one small step forward and asked a normal question, "What time is our flight?" And my father's face changed. He glanced at my mother. They shared that look, that silent coordination. And he said, "You don't need to know, Wendy." And my brain did this fast inventory, like, what did I do wrong? Why does this feel like danger? And then he said, "You're not part of this trip." And my mother added, "Someone has. To stay behind and take care of the kids." Like she was delegating a task to an employee, and Megan didn't even flinch, and Derek said, "It's just a week." Without looking at me, and my mother delivered the final punch with that icy certainty. "You don't have anything important to do?" Megan works hard. She deserves a break. And I wanted to laugh because Megan doesn't work. She has a nanny. And Derek makes more in a month than I used to make in a year. But I didn't laugh. I smiled because 30 people were watching, and I've been conditioned to protect their image even while they destroy mine. I walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter with my eyes closed, hearing the party continue without me. And I had this neurotic, spiraling thought that made me nauseous. Not just that they didn't invite me, but that they planned this humiliation like it was a normal family logistics meeting, and I could feel something crack inside me, not a dramatic shatter, more like a fault line shifting, a quiet internal no, forming for the first time. And then Megan came in to do damage. Control in her soft voice. "Don't be upset, you know how it is." And then she said the phrase that finally made everything click. "Your schedule is flexible," as if my life was a blank calendar waiting for their appointments. And she started listing the kids' allergies and routines like I'd already agreed. And she left, and I stood there staring at her text instructions and realized the truth in a clean, brutal sentence. They don't see me as family, they see me as staff, and staff can resign. That night, after midnight, when I opened my mother's laptop to send a file to a client because my own laptop was at home and the party had stolen my time, I saw her Gmail logged in, and I saw a thread with my name in the subject line. Hawaii arrangements, Wendy situation. And I clicked even though I knew better, because there are moments when your body wants proof more than it wants peace. And I read my mother's words. Keep Wendy here to watch the kids. She doesn't have anything important to do anyway. It's like having free help. She should be grateful we give her something to do. And Megan replied, totally agree. She'll probably feel useful for once. It's kind of sad. And I took screenshots with hands so steady it scared me, because that's what happens when denial dies. You get calm. I drove home at 1 a.m. to my small apartment, sat in the dark, opened Marcus Coleman's email again. And for the first time, I didn't read it like a fantasy. I read it like a plan. Then I called Aunt Ruth. And she answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting her whole life for me to finally choose myself. And when she said, I have a spare room above the cafe and the gallery is 20 minutes away, I felt my throat tighten, because the offer wasn't just a bed. It was a new identity. It was a doorway out of the Dixon system. By 6 a.m., I was packing 3 suitcases, my camera gear, my laptop, the cashmere scarf, and I left behind the glittery world's best and apron like it was a costume I'd finally taken off. And as I folded my clothes, I kept hearing my father's voice, "You're not part of this trip." And it kept translating in my head into what it really meant. You're not part of us. And instead of collapsing, I felt something else. A sharp, clean anger. Not rage, not screaming anger. More like the kind of anger that becomes fuel. And I made a decision that wasn't emotional, it was logistical. I would not announce it in a dramatic way that gave them time to sabotage me. I would not beg for understanding. I would not negotiate my own freedom like a child asking permission. I would do what adults do when they quit. I would leave, and the first time my family would fully understand my value would be the moment they couldn't access it. If you've ever been the default caregiver, the unpaid assistant, the family janitor who gets called selfish the second you say no, tell me in the comments whether my parents crossed a line or whether family loyalty is supposed to include public humiliation and unpaid labor, because I promise you what happened next made that anniversary night look like a warm-up. And the moment I finally told them I was not watching those kids, the entire Dixon family mask slipped in a way I didn't even know was possible. And the most dangerous part wasn't their anger. It was how quickly they tried to rewrite reality while I was standing right in front of them. 2 days before my family's Hawaii trip, I drove back to my parents' house with my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Not because I was nervous about confrontation, but because I was recalibrating my entire identity in real time, reminding myself that I wasn't a child asking permission anymore. I was an adult making a decision, and those two things feel radically different in the body, even if the road looks the same. The white colonial house came into view, pristine lawn, shutters perfectly aligned, American flag hanging at the exact angle my mother preferred. The kind of suburban performance that always made me feel like I was stepping onto a stage where I already knew my role and lines. I parked on the street, of course, because Megan's Lexus had already claimed the driveway, even though she wasn't leaving until the next morning. And I felt a strange calm wash over me at the absurd consistency of it all, like the universe was giving me one last visual reminder of exactly what I was walking away from. Inside, the house smelled like fresh laundry and lemon cleaner, the scent of order and control. And I could hear my mother in the living room coordinating outfits with Megan for their tropical fantasy, while Derek's voice floated faintly from upstairs on what was probably another conference call about billable hours and strategic positioning. My father sat in his armchair with the newspaper open like a shield, the same posture he'd held my entire childhood whenever conflict loomed, present in body, absent in responsibility. I stood in the doorway for a second and watched them like a researcher observing a familiar experiment play out exactly as predicted. Then I spoke. I need to tell you something. My mother didn't look up immediately. If this is about the kids' schedule, Megan already sent you everything. There it was. Assumption baked into muscle memory. It's not about that, I said, steadying my voice. I'm not watching the kids. I won't be available. That sentence landed in the room like a dropped plate. Megan's head snapped up. My mother's hands froze mid-fold on a stack of sundresses. My father lowered the newspaper, just enough to peek over the edge, like a cautious animal. What do you mean, you won't be available? My mother asked, her voice already sharpening into accusation. I have a work opportunity in California. I said, keeping it intentionally vague because I didn't know them access to my future. I'm leaving tomorrow. California. The word hung in the air like a foreign language. My father frowned. What kind of work opportunity? Professional, I replied. Megan stood up. Wendy, you can't be serious. I'm counting on you. We planned this. I felt a small, almost bitter smile touch my lips. You planned around me without asking me. I'm not canceling my life because you assumed I didn't have one. The silence that followed felt dense, like humidity before a storm. My mother was the first to recover, as she always did, standing up straighter, shoulders back, voice adopting that moral superiority tone she used whenever she wanted to reframe control as virtue. This is incredibly selfish, Wendy. Megan needs your help. Family comes first. Family comes first. The slogan of every emotionally exploitative system ever built. Family comes first, I repeated calmly, except when it comes to inviting me to Hawaii. For once, the words hit their target. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. No immediate spin. No clever justification ready. My father cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice low and brittle. If you leave, don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms. I nodded slowly. I understand. And for the first time in my life, I meant it without fear. That's when the emotional manipulation campaign began, right on schedule, like a corporate escalation protocol. 6 voicemails from my mother over the next 24 hours, each one escalating in drama and moral pressure. You're tearing this family apart. Your father is devastated, Megan cried all evening. The children keep asking where Aunt Wendy is going. Like I was personally destabilizing the emotional economy of the Dixon household simply by choosing autonomy. Megan took a different angle, texting with wounded vulnerability. I don't understand why you're doing this to me. I'm your sister. Don't you care about us at all? And then the final attempt at psychological intimidation. You're going to end up alone, just like Aunt Ruth. Is that what you want? That line almost made me laugh out loud because the insult accidentally revealed the truth they were terrified of. Aunt Ruth was free. She had built a life that didn't require anyone's approval. And my mother hated her for it because Ruth represented the path Patricia had been too afraid to take. I turned off my phone and finished packing. 3 suitcases, my camera equipment, my laptop, the cashmere scarf that had protected my secret life for 3 years, and I left behind everything that belonged to the version of me that survived by shrinking, including that ridiculous glittery, world's best aunt, apron folded in the back of a drawer like a retired costume. Before sunrise, I walked through my small apartment one last time. Beige carpet, second-hand couch, walls that had absorbed years of quiet resignation. And instead of sadness, I felt gratitude because this place had kept me alive long enough to outgrow it. I taped my spare key to an envelope for the landlord, slid it under his door, loaded my Honda Civic as the sky lightened into pale gray, and pulled away without looking back because nostalgia is a dangerous liar when you're trying to evolve. The drive from Boston to Carmel by the Sea is long enough to feel like a psychological detox. 5 days of diners, roadside motels, unfamiliar skies, strangers who didn't know my name or my role or my history. And with every mile the internal noise softened, the constant background anxiety of anticipating other people's needs finally quieting like a radio fading into static. Somewhere in Nebraska, I pulled into a rest stop and watched the sunset stretch gold across open prairie, the kind of vastness that makes your problems feel appropriately small. And I photographed it, the first image I'd taken as someone who no longer belonged to anyone else's expectations. On the 3rd day, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my phone back on to check directions, only to see a text from Megan. Mom says if you're not home when we get back from Hawaii, you're dead to her. I stared at the sentence for a few seconds, felt absolutely nothing, and deleted it. She'd been emotionally killing me for decades anyway. At least now the metaphor matched the behavior. On the 4th day, I called Aunt Ruth from a gas station in Arizona, the desert heat shimmering off asphalt like a mirage. I'm about 8 hours out, I said. "Your room is ready," she replied, warm and steady. "Fresh sheets, ocean view, and Marcus wants to meet you tomorrow afternoon if you're up for it." Tomorrow. The word made my stomach flip with excitement and fear braided together. When I crossed into California and the Pacific finally appeared, vast and blue and indifferent to my family drama, I rolled down the window and breathed salt air like oxygen after years underwater and cried, not from sadness, but from relief so sharp it almost hurt. Aunt Ruth was waiting on the porch of her cafe when I arrived, arms open, smile wide, the kind of welcome that doesn't come with conditions or expectations. "Welcome home," she said, and something inside me finally unclenched. Carmel by the sea felt like stepping into a painting. Cottages with crooked rooftops, art galleries tucked into every corner, ocean mist drifting through cypress trees like a living dream. And Aunt Ruth's cafe, the ceramic cup, sat 2 blocks from the beach with blue shutters and window boxes overflowing with lavender, the pottery studio humming quietly in the back where she shaped clay like meditation. My room upstairs was small but bright, white quilt, desk by the window, a view of the Pacific that made my chest ache with possibility. "You'll work the morning shift," Ruth said casually over dinner. 6 to noon. Afternoons are yours. No guilt, no obligation theater, just mutual respect. The next morning, I tied on a simple canvas apron embroidered with the cafe logo and learned how to make pour-over coffee. Chatted with locals who called Ruth by name, tourists charmed by homemade scones. And by noon I had $37 in tips and more genuine smiles than I had received in months of family service. At 2 o'clock, I walked 3 blocks to Coastal Light Gallery with my heart pounding like I was about to step onto a stage I'd secretly rehearsed for 3 years. Marcus Coleman wasn't the intimidating art world caricature I'd imagined. He was tall, weathered, silver-haired, kind-eyed, wearing a linen shirt with rolled sleeves and a smile that made you feel welcome instead of evaluated. "Wendy Dixon," he said warmly, "Ruth's told me about you, but the work speaks for itself." He led me through the gallery, clean white walls, natural light, serious curation, and explained how one of my photographs, an elderly woman waiting patiently at a bus stop, had stopped in mid-scroll because there was something in her eyes most photographers miss. "You see people," he said quietly, "really see them." Then he offered me a solo exhibition. 15 pieces, 6 weeks. The gallery would cover printing, framing, marketing. I'd keep 60% of sales. My hand shook as I signed the contract. Seeing my name printed as artist Wendy Dixon in official type felt surreal, like reality finally catching up to a version of myself I'd only known privately. I walked out of that gallery holding the contract against my chest like proof of existence. While I was building this new life, my absence was quietly detonating the Dixon family ecosystem back in Hawaii. I didn't witness the chaos firsthand, but I received fragments through unanswered texts and one awkward voicemail from my father asking where Oliver's medication records were, because nobody could find them. Without me there to babysit, Megan and Derek discovered that parenting is less relaxing when you actually have to do it. Oliver threw tantrums because his routines were disrupted. Sophie developed an ear infection, and nobody remembered which pediatrician she saw. My mother spent most of the trip complaining that the resort staff wasn't attentive enough, furious that luxury still required effort when there was no Wendy buffer absorbing the stress. The messages kept coming. What's Oliver's bedtime routine? What does Sophie eat when she's fussy? The kids won't sleep. And for the first time in my life, I didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of boundary. I was busy printing proofs, selecting frames, prepping for interviews, finally investing energy into something that invested back into me. Then something interesting happened on day 6 of their vacation. Megan Googled my name. For the first time ever, my digital footprint wasn't blank. My anonymous Instagram had been featured by a small art blog Marcus knew, and suddenly Wendy the Invisible Helper had an online presence that didn't revolve around service. She saw the photos. She saw the follower count. She saw the comments from strangers calling my work powerful, moving, necessary. And that's when the narrative started shifting from Wendy abandoned us to Wendy has something we didn't control. When my exhibition opening finally arrived 6 weeks later, the gallery buzzed with guests, champagne glasses clinking, a string quartet filling the space with soft music, my photographs hanging large and confident on the walls, price tags that made my brain short-circuit. Aunt Ruth stood beside me, beaming like a proud co-conspirator. Within the first hour, one of the pieces sold. Then another. Then a third. A collector named Mrs. Peton purchased the bus stop photograph for $3,000. $3,000 for something my hands and eyes created. I felt dizzy in the best way. Marcus introduced me to a journalist from Carmel magazine who hinted at a possible feature. My life was accelerating in directions I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. And then the gallery door opened and everything tilted. Megan and Derek walked in, still sunburned from Hawaii, scanning the room like tourists who'd accidentally wandered into a museum they didn't understand. Megan's face lit up when she saw me. "Wendy!" she exclaimed loudly, rushing toward me like we were long-lost friends. "We've been so worried about you." 50 heads turned. My stomach tightened. "This is unexpected," I said evenly. "We had to come," she continued breathlessly. "Mom found your Instagram. She's been trying to track you down." Derek nodded stiffly. "Nice place," he muttered. "It's a gallery," I said. "My gallery opening." Megan blinked. "You did all this?" Her tone wasn't admiration. It was confusion. Like I'd violated a rule she didn't realize existed. She leaned closer and dropped the bomb with casual entitlement. "I'm pregnant again, Wendy. Number 3. I really need you to come home. Mom's useless with the kids, and Derek's schedule is insane. I need you." There it was again. Need. Not congratulations. Not pride. Not apology. Just extraction. I could feel the room listening now, even if they pretended not to. "I'm in the middle of my opening night," I said quietly. "I know, this is cute," she said dismissively, waving her hand at my work like it was a hobby fair booth. "But we can talk later. When are you coming back?" Aunt Ruth stepped closer instinctively, sensing the shift. Mrs. Peton hovered nearby, curiosity sharp in her eyes. The air felt charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Megan didn't realize it yet, but she had walked into the wrong room with the wrong assumptions, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to shrink to make her comfortable, because what I was about to say would finally force the Dixon family to confront the version of me they never bothered to see, and the consequences of that confrontation were going to ripple far beyond this gallery wall. Megan's words hung between us like a bad smell. "I need you," and something inside me finally snapped into clarity, not anger exactly, more like a quiet decision locking into place the way a door clicks shut when you're finally inside the right room. And I realized in that instant that no matter what I said, this conversation was never going to be private, because entitlement always expects an audience, even when it pretends to whisper. And sure enough, I could feel eyes drifting toward us from all corners of the gallery. Champagne pauses, conversation slowing, the subtle human instinct to sense drama before it announces itself. I took a breath, felt the floor under my shoes, felt the presence of my own work on the walls like witnesses backing me up, and said calmly, "Megan, I'm not coming back to Boston to be your childcare." Her face twitched like I'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. "Wendy, don't be ridiculous. I'm pregnant. I need help," she said, lowering her voice but not her entitlement. "You can hire help," I replied evenly. "Derek makes more than enough, and you've never had a problem spending money on convenience. What you can't do is assume my life exists to subsidize yours." Her eyes widened. "Since when are you like this?" she snapped, the first hint of irritation surfacing. I almost laughed because that question alone exposed the entire dynamic. Since when do I have boundaries? Since when do I get to say no? Since when am I not automatically compliant furniture in the background of your life? "Since I realize my time has value," I said, and I gestured lightly to the photographs around us, This is my work, Megan. I've been building this for 3 years while everyone assumed I had nothing important to do. She glanced around, really looking for the first time, seeing the framed pieces, the red dots on some of the placards, the quiet confidence of the space, and I could see the recalculation happening behind her eyes like a spreadsheet suddenly discovering new variables. But this is just pictures, she said weakly, trying to shrink it back into something manageable, something non-threatening. That's when Mrs. Peton, the collector who had already purchased one of my pieces, stepped closer, champagne glass in hand, voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. I just paid $3,000 for one of those pictures, she said pleasantly. If that's nothing, I'd love to see what you consider something. Megan's face drained of color. Derek stiffened beside her, his corporate composure cracking slightly. Who are you? He asked defensively. Someone who values talent, Mrs. Peton replied coolly, and someone who finds it fascinating that this young woman's family seems more interested in using her than celebrating her. The temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. I could feel the gallery collectively lean in, curiosity sharpened into attention, and for a brief moment the old Wendy instinct whispered in my ear, don't make a scene, protect the family image, smooth it over, disappear, but that voice felt ancient now, like a bad habit I'd finally outgrown. Megan, I said, clearly no longer whispering, I'm happy for your pregnancy, genuinely, but I won't be rearranging my life to make yours easier. You can build your own support systems like every other adult on this planet. Her eyes filled with tears, not the performative ones she used when she wanted sympathy from our parents, but real ones edged with humiliation and disbelief. You're embarrassing me, she hissed. I tilted my head slightly. You embarrassed me in front of 30 people when you agreed I should be excluded from a family vacation so I could babysit, remember? And that's when Aunt Ruth's voice entered the conversation like a blade, sliding, cleanly through tension. And you embarrassed her even more in those emails you never expected her to read. Ruth said gently but firmly. Megan froze. Derek turned sharply toward Ruth. What emails? He demanded. Megan's mouth opened, closed, opened again, no sound coming out. Around us, several guests had openly stopped pretending to browse art. The journalist Marcus had introduced me to earlier, subtly angled her body closer, pen already moving like a bloodhound catching a scent. I pulled my phone from my purse calmly, my hand steady, the screenshots glowing on the screen like quiet ammunition. My mother wrote, I read aloud in a steady voice, keep Wendy here to watch the kids. She doesn't have anything important to do anyway. It's like having free help. She should be grateful we give her something to do. And Megan replied, totally agree. She'll probably feel useful for once. It's kind of sad. And the silence that followed felt like the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Megan's face flushed deep red. Derek stared at her like he was seeing a stranger. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, the kind of collective human discomfort that happens when private cruelty becomes public truth. Mrs. Peton raised her eyebrows slightly, impressed not by the drama, but by the clarity of the boundary being drawn. The journalist's pen moved faster. Megan finally whispered, You weren't supposed to see that. I met her eyes calmly. Exactly. That single word carried 3 decades of erasure, of being unseen until it was convenient. Derek stepped forward, voice tight with irritation. This is family business, Wendy. You're airing dirty laundry in public. I didn't even look at him when I replied. You brought this into public when you showed up here demanding my labor instead of celebrating my work. And that's when Marcus quietly stepped closer, positioning himself nearby like a neutral authority figure ready to maintain professional boundaries if things escalated further. Megan wiped at her cheeks, mascara smearing. I didn't mean it like that, she said weakly. How exactly did you mean it? Mrs. Peton asked mildly, sipping her champagne. Megan had no answer. That's the thing about entitlement. It functions beautifully in silence and collapses under direct questioning. For a moment, nobody spoke. The string quartet continued playing softly in the background like a surreal soundtrack to a psychological reckoning. Then Marcus broke the silence with a gentle clap, not sarcastic, not performative, but supportive, and Aunt Ruth joined him immediately, and a few other guests followed until the applause spread organically through the room. Not for the drama, not for the confrontation, but for the boundary being drawn, for the quiet dignity of someone finally claiming their space. I felt a strange warmth rise in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, but validation, something I'd rarely experienced in my own family. Megan looked around in disbelief as the applause faded, her narrative collapsing in real time. "You're all taking her side," she muttered. Mrs. Petton smiled politely. "We're taking the side of someone who values her own life." Megan turned back to me, voice cracking. "So that's it, you're just abandoning us." I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm choosing myself, there's a difference. And if you ever want a relationship with me, it has to be one where I'm treated as an equal human being, not unpaid labor." Derek looked away, jaw tight, the first sign that his usual verbal dominance had failed him in a room that didn't care about his job title. Megan stood there for a few seconds longer, then turned abruptly and walked toward the exit, Derek following a step behind, his posture stiff with embarrassment. The gallery exhaled collectively once the door closed behind them, like a held breath finally released. Aunt Ruth squeezed my arm gently. "You handled that beautifully," she said. Marcus nodded approvingly. "I've hosted a lot of openings," he added quietly. "That was memorable in the right way." I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, feeling lighter, steadier, more grounded than I ever had in a confrontation with my family. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream. More conversations, more genuine interest in my work, another photograph sold. Then another, collectors exchanging cards, the journalists scheduling a follow-up interview. And every interaction felt like a brick being laid in a new foundation that wasn't built on obligation or invisibility. By the time the gallery began to close, 8 of the 15 photographs had sold, totaling $14,000 in revenue. My portion, just over $8,000, more than I'd made in months of accounting work. And Marcus handed me the printout with a proud grin, like a coach congratulating an athlete after a breakthrough performance. "Not bad for an opening night," he said. "Mrs. Petton also wants to commission a piece," he added casually. "She has a place in Big Sur, wants you to photograph the coastline." A commission, a real one. I tucked the business card into my clutch like a small golden ticket. The journalist confirmed they were considering me for a feature in Carmel magazine, possibly even a cover if the editor approved. My life felt like it was accelerating forward while my old life was finally being forced to sit still and confront its own behavior. That night, Aunt Ruth helped me carry the remaining unsold prints back to my room above the cafe, 7 pieces still waiting for the right homes, and I placed a check carefully on my desk and stared at my name printed on it like it might vanish if I blinked too hard, proof that my value existed outside anyone's permission. Over the next few weeks, the ripples from that gallery confrontation traveled back to Boston in ways I didn't fully anticipate. My mother called repeatedly at first, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between outrage and wounded martyrdom. "You humiliated us. People are talking. You've turned your back on family." Each message dripping with the same manipulation I'd grown up breathing like air, but now it landed differently, like static instead of command. I didn't return the calls. Megan texted once, a long, rambling message alternating between apology and defensiveness. "I didn't realize you felt so used. You should have told me. But you embarrassed me in front of strangers. I'm stressed with the pregnancy." And I read it once, then replied simply, "I'm open to rebuilding our relationship if it's respectful and equal," and left it there. My father surprised me with a short email a week later. 3 sentences. "I saw the article online about your gallery. I didn't realize you were this serious about photography. I'm proud of you." I read that email several times, not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged reality in a way he never had before. Meanwhile, my days in Carmel settled into a rhythm that felt like actual living instead of surviving, Mornings at the cafe with locals who learned my name and asked about my work. Afternoons in a small, rented studio editing photos. Planning the commission shoot in Big Sur. Responding to messages from women who'd read the magazine feature and recognized themselves in my story. Messages like, "I thought I was the only one. I didn't know you were allowed to leave. Thank you for showing me. It's possible." And every one of those messages felt like a small echo of the invisible women I'd been photographing for years, now finally visible to each other. My second exhibition began taking shape under Marcus's guidance, a new series exploring boundaries, thresholds, the invisible lines between obligation and exploitation, connection and control. And it felt deeply personal without being bitter, like creative alchemy, turning old pain into something useful. And yet, even as my new life expanded, a quiet tension lingered in the background. Because unresolved systems don't disappear politely, they wait for leverage. And part of me knew my family hadn't truly processed what had happened yet. They'd simply retreated to regroup. And experience had taught me that the most dangerous manipulations often arrive disguised as reconciliation. Apologies that sound reasonable until you look closely at what they're actually asking you to give up again. I could feel another confrontation brewing. Not explosive, not dramatic, but strategic, the kind that tests whether your boundaries are real or just situational. And the next move wouldn't happen in a gallery full of witnesses. It would happen quietly, personally, in a way that forced me to decide whether the woman I was becoming was strong enough to hold the line when the pressure returned in a softer, more seductive form. Because the real test of change isn't how you perform under spotlight. It's how you protect yourself when nobody is watching and old patterns come knocking disguised as peace offerings. The first sign that my family was preparing a softer, more dangerous kind of counterattack came disguised as something almost reasonable, a message from my mother that didn't scream, didn't accuse, didn't guilt trip in the usual theatrical way, but instead adopted that calm, wounded tone that always meant she was trying to regain control without looking like the villain. "Wendy, I've had time to reflect. I think emotions ran high at the gallery. I'd like us to talk like adults and clear the air." Clear the air. That phrase alone carried 1,000 invisible hooks, because in my family, clearing the air never meant accountability. It meant resetting the power dynamic back to where it had always been. Smoothing over discomfort, so the system could continue functioning exactly as before. I didn't respond immediately. I sat in my small studio space, 3 blocks from the cafe, sunlight slanting through the window, dust motes floating like tiny galaxies, my camera resting on the desk beside me. And I let myself actually feel the moment instead of reacting automatically. Old Wendy would have replied within minutes, eager to soothe, eager to repair, eager to make things comfortable again, even if comfort came at her own expense. New Wendy paused. I asked myself a question that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. What do I want out of this interaction? Not what do they want, not what keeps the peace, not what avoids conflict, but what actually protects my well-being and forward momentum. The answer wasn't dramatic. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want an apology performance. I wanted clarity and boundaries. So I replied with one sentence, "I'm open to talking as long as the conversation stays respectful and honest." That single word, honest, was the landmine. The call came the next evening. I recognized my mother's number immediately and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. But instead of letting it spiral into dread, I grounded myself in my physical environment. The smell of coffee drifting up from the cafe below, the faint sound of ocean wind rattling the windows, the solid weight of the chair beneath me, small anchors reminding my nervous system that I was not a trapped child in a suburban living room anymore. "Hello, Mom," I said evenly. "Wendy," she replied, her voice soft, almost tender. "I've missed you." There it was, the emotional hook baited with nostalgia. "I'm doing well," I said calmly. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied, then a brief pause, strategic. "Your father showed me the magazine article. You look happy." The hesitation before the word happy didn't go unnoticed. "I am," I said simply. Silence again. Then she sighed, the long-suffering sigh she'd perfected over decades. I suppose I didn't realize how important this photography thing was to you. Translation. I didn't take you seriously until other people validated you. It's been important for a long time, I replied. I just didn't feel safe sharing it before. Another pause, heavier this time. I think we all made mistakes, she said cautiously, attempting to distribute responsibility like shared blame is emotional amnesty. But families forgive each other. That's what makes us family. And there it was, the pivot, forgiveness framed as obligation instead of earned repair. I leaned back in my chair, letting myself fully register how familiar the script was, how many times I'd swallowed my own discomfort to preserve her comfort, and something inside me felt almost clinical now, like observing a behavioral pattern rather than being swallowed by it. Forgiveness isn't the same as pretending nothing happened, I said gently. I'm willing to move forward, but not back into the same dynamic. Her tone cooled slightly. What dynamic exactly? She asked, innocence polished like porcelain. The one where my time and labor were treated as automatically available, I replied. The one where I was excluded from family experiences, but expected to carry the responsibility. Silence stretched. I could practically feel her recalculating. You always helped willingly, she said finally. You never complained. That sentence landed with surgical precision because it revealed the core moral blind spot of exploitative systems. Compliance is interpreted as consent even when it's rooted in conditioning. I didn't complain because I didn't think I was allowed to, I said. That doesn't make it healthy. Her voice sharpened a fraction. So what do you want, Wendy, for us to grovel? She asked, defensiveness creeping in. I want mutual respect, I replied calmly. I want to be invited to family things because I'm family, not because I'm useful. I want my time to be treated as valuable, and I won't be providing unpaid childcare going forward. The line went very quiet. I could almost hear her jaw tightening on the other end. Megan is pregnant, she said pointedly, as if invoking pregnancy like a legal statute that overrides boundaries. Megan is capable, I replied, and Megan has resources. The sigh returned, this time edged with irritation. You've changed, she said, not as observation but accusation. I smiled slightly to myself. Yes, I said, I have. The call ended politely but stiffly, no emotional resolution, no warm closure, just a thin layer of civility stretched over unresolved tension. When I hung up, I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired, but clean, like after a long overdue deep scrub. And yet I knew that conversation wasn't the end of it. Systems that rely on control don't surrender easily. They probe for weakness, for emotional leverage, for moments of vulnerability they can exploit. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the next move arrived in the form of a text from Megan. Hey, can we talk? I'm really struggling. My first reaction was concern, because despite everything, she was still my sister and my nervous system had been trained to respond to distress signals automatically. But instead of jumping in emotionally, I paused again. I asked myself what struggling meant in this context. Was it emotional connection or logistical extraction? I replied, Sure, what's going on? Her response came quickly. I'm overwhelmed, Mom and I keep fighting, Derek's barely home, and I'm scared about handling 3 kids. I just need you. There it was again. Need. Not I miss you. Not I'm sorry. Not I want to rebuild. Just need. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility tugging at my chest, the old reflex to step in and stabilize chaos that wasn't actually mine to carry. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally writing, I'm happy to support you emotionally, but I'm not available to relocate or provide childcare. Several minutes passed. Then the reply came, so you're really choosing your career over your family. That sentence triggered a flicker of anger, sharp and clean, because it framed autonomy as betrayal and sacrifice as virtue, the same moral trap that had kept me small for decades. I took a breath and responded, I'm choosing a balanced life where I'm not exploited, That doesn't mean I don't care about you. Her reply was shorter this time. I don't recognize you anymore. I almost laughed softly at that because she was right. She didn't recognize me because the version of me she knew existed to meet her needs. That's okay, I wrote. I'm still getting to know myself too. The conversation fizzled after that, unresolved but clear, the boundary holding despite the emotional pressure. Over the next month, my life continued expanding in ways that made the old version of me feel like a distant relative rather than a current identity. The commission shoot in Big Sur went better than I'd imagined. Fog rolling dramatically over cliffs, waves crashing against dark rock like punctuation marks, and Mrs. Peton was thrilled with the results, leading to another referral and another paid opportunity. Marcus secured a second exhibition date for spring. The magazine feature brought a steady stream of inquiries and messages from women across the country who saw themselves in my story, women who had been the default caregivers, the invisible stabilizers, the emotional janitors of their families, and every message felt like confirmation that this wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern so many people silently endure because nobody ever names it. One afternoon, while editing photos in my studio, I caught my reflection in the window glass and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not physically, but energetically, my posture was more open, my face more relaxed, my eyes less guarded. And it struck me how deeply emotional environments shape the nervous system, how living in constant low-grade obligation subtly trains your body to stay braced, waiting for the next demand. Freedom wasn't just psychological, it was physiological. And yet, just when life felt steady, the universe delivered another test, not for my parents or Megan, but for my father, the quiet variable who had always hidden behind neutrality. His email arrived unexpectedly on a Sunday morning. Subject line simply coffee, and the message read, I'm in California for a conference this week. Would you be open to meeting for coffee? I'd like to talk. My first reaction was surprise. My second was caution, because my father had spent most of my life avoiding emotional responsibility by staying silent, and silence is its own form of complicity. I debated ignoring the message altogether, but something in me felt curious rather than threatened, curious to see whether he could show up differently or whether he would simply act as a messenger for the family system. I replied that I was open to meeting in a public place. We met 2 days later at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. He looked older than I remembered, more lined around the eyes, shoulders slightly slumped, like a man who'd been carrying quiet tension for a long time without naming it. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other in an awkward silence that felt heavier than any argument. Finally, he cleared his throat. I didn't handle the Hawaii thing well, he said quietly. It wasn't an apology yet, but it was closer than I'd ever heard him come. I nodded, but didn't rush to reassure him. I should have spoken up, he continued. I've spent too many years letting your mother steer the family because it was easier than confronting conflict. That sentence landed with more weight than he probably realized. Easier for who? I asked gently. He winced slightly. For me, he admitted. Not for you. We sat with that truth for a moment, the sound of gulls outside filling the silence like background commentary. I read the magazine article, he said after a pause. You sounded strong, different. I smiled faintly. I am. He nodded slowly. I'm proud of you, he said more firmly this time. And I'm sorry I didn't protect you when I should have. The apology wasn't perfect. It didn't undo decades of neglect, but it was real enough to matter. Thank you, I said simply. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and unfamiliar respect. Your mother doesn't understand what's happening, he added cautiously. She feels like she's losing control. I almost laughed. She is losing control, I replied. That's kind of the point. He exhaled slowly, half amused, half uneasy. I suppose it is. We talked for another hour about neutral topics, travel, the weather, his retirement boredom, but something subtle had shifted. He wasn't talking over me. He wasn't dismissive. He was listening in a way I hadn't experienced before. And when we parted, the interaction felt like the beginning of a new, healthier configuration rather than a return to the old one. Still, I knew better than to assume one respectful conversation meant the entire system had transformed. Change creates instability before it creates equilibrium, and unresolved dynamics often reemerge when external stress hits. Sure enough, a month later, I received a late-night voicemail from Megan, her voice shaky, crying, breath uneven. "Wendy, I don't know what to do. Mom and I had a huge fight. She said some awful things. Derek's working late again. I feel completely alone." My heart clenched instinctively, empathy flooding in before logic could catch up, and for a brief moment I felt that old gravitational pull to rush in and stabilize the chaos, to become the emotional safety net everyone relied on. But then I paused, breathed, and remembered the pattern, remembered how easily care becomes captivity when boundaries dissolve. I listened to the message twice, not to feed the anxiety, but to assess what was actually being asked. She wasn't asking for advice. She wasn't asking for emotional connection. She was asking for rescue. And rescue had always come at the cost of my autonomy. I didn't call back immediately. I waited until the next morning, grounded myself, and then sent a message instead of calling. "I'm sorry you're having a hard night. I care about you. I'm here to talk and support you emotionally. I can't step into fixing the situation or taking responsibility for it." Several minutes passed. Then she replied, "So what am I supposed to do?" I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar frustration rise, the expectation that I would provide the solution. "Figure out what support looks like for you that doesn't depend on me sacrificing my life," I wrote honestly. The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, appeared again, and finally stopped. No reply. That silence felt different from before. Not punitive, not manipulative, but contemplative, like something had actually landed. I set my phone down and looked out the window at the Pacific stretching endlessly toward the horizon, waves folding into themselves over and over like proof that motion doesn't require permission. I realized then that the real victory wasn't public confrontations or financial success or even validation from strangers. It was this quiet, internal consistency, the ability to hold a boundary without rage, without guilt, without needing the other person to agree in order for it to remain real. And yet, deep down, I also sensed that this story wasn't finished, because families built on imbalance rarely dissolve cleanly. They evolve, adapt, and sometimes attempt one final dramatic maneuver when they realize the old leverage is truly gone. And the next chapter wouldn't test my strength in public or through obvious manipulation. It would test it in the most seductive way possible, through something that looked like reconciliation, generosity, even love, a gesture that on the surface would appear generous, but underneath carried the same invisible strings I had finally learned how to see. The offer arrived on a Tuesday morning in an envelope thicker than any mail I'd received in years, my name printed neatly on the front in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, the kind that always looked like it was performing for an audience, even when no one was watching. And for a moment, I simply held it without opening it, feeling the weight of it, the symbolic gravity of something that had traveled across states, carrying intention inside paper fibers, because letters from my mother were never neutral. They were instruments. They either delivered praise as leverage or disappointment as pressure. And as I stood in the small kitchen above the cafe, coffee brewing, ocean light filtering through the curtains, I felt the familiar flicker of apprehension mixed with curiosity, the same emotional cocktail that had kept me tethered for decades. But this time the apprehension didn't know me. It just registered like a weather pattern passing through. And when I finally slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the pages, I immediately recognized the strategic tone shift, not cold, not accusatory, not dramatic, but warm, conciliatory, almost nostalgic, the voice she used when she wanted to soften resistance before redirecting control. "Wendy, I've been doing a lot of thinking since your father's trip and our last conversation. I realize we've all made mistakes, and life is too short to stay divided. I want us to start fresh as a family. Your father and I would like to help you invest in your future." We're prepared to contribute financially to support your art career if you're willing to come home for a while, so we can reconnect and rebuild. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in fully, not just what they said, but what they implied, because on the surface it looked generous, supportive even, the kind of offer outsiders would praise as parental love and reconciliation. But underneath it pulsed with familiar circuitry. Come home. Rebuild on our terms. Reinsert yourself into the environment where we have leverage. And the financial aspect wasn't kindness, it was collateral. Money has always been my mother's. Preferred language of power. Money creates obligation, dependency, narrative ownership, the ability to later say we helped you, you owe us. And as I folded the letter back into the envelope, a strange calm settled over me. Not anger, not panic, but clarity. The kind that only comes when you finally learn to recognize patterns instead of individual events. This wasn't a new offer. It was the same contract, rewritten with prettier font. Still, I didn't dismiss it outright, because growth doesn't mean avoidance, it means conscious evaluation. So I carried the letter with me to the studio, set it beside my editing desk, and let it sit there while I worked on a new series, adjusting contrast, balancing shadows, refining the delicate line between visibility and anonymity that had become my artistic signature. And as I worked, I noticed how my body felt. Grounded, steady, unhurried, not braced for the next demand, and that physical. Sensation became part of my decision-making process, because the nervous system knows truth long before the intellect catches up. Around noon, Aunt Ruth stopped by with her usual coffee delivery and observational commentary, noticing the envelope immediately because nothing escaped her artist's eye. "That looks serious," she said lightly. "It is," I replied, handing her the letter. She read it slowly, eyebrows lifting just slightly at certain phrases, a micro-expression of recognition rather than surprise. "Ah," she said when she finished, folding it neatly. "The golden olive branch." I smiled. "That's exactly what it feels like." She leaned against the counter, studying me. "How does your body feel when you imagine going back?" she asked, bypassing logic entirely. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured it, the white colonial house, the controlled conversations, the subtle expectations, the invisible scoreboard of obligation always ticking in the background. And immediately my chest tightened, shoulders creeping upward, breath becoming shallow, a visceral stress response my body remembered all too well. "Constricted," I said honestly, like I'd be shrinking again. She nodded knowingly. "And how does your body feel when you imagine staying here and continuing what you're building?" The contrast was immediate, breath deeper, shoulders relaxed, a quiet sense of expansion behind the ribs. "Open," I said. "Steady." Ruth smiled softly. "Your nervous system just answered the question for you." But even with that clarity, I knew responding would ripple outward, and part of me wanted to handle it intentionally rather than reactively. So instead of replying immediately, I wrote a draft response in my notes app, not to send, just to articulate my boundaries clearly to myself first, because once they were clear internally, communicating them externally would be easier. I wrote that I appreciated the sentiment, but was not interested in relocating, that financial support tied to proximity or control wasn't something I would accept, that reconnection could only happen without conditions or leverage. And as I read the draft back, I felt a strange sense of power in how clean and simple it was, no emotional justification, no defensive elaboration, just truth. And when I finally sent a version of it later that evening, my finger hovered over the send button for a split second, not out of fear, but out of awareness that this moment mattered, that this was another micro-decision, reinforcing the new architecture of my life, and then I pressed send. The response came 2 days later, shorter than expected. "I'm disappointed you won't consider our offer. We were hoping to help you stabilize instead of struggle unnecessarily. Let us know if you change your mind." There it was, the subtle jab embedded inside the disappointment, the implication that my independence was instability, that my growth was risk, that safety only existed inside their structure. And instead of reacting emotionally, I observed the tactic with almost clinical interest. Because once you see manipulation clearly, it loses much of its power. It becomes predictable rather than personal. And I didn't reply further. Life continued unfolding in tangible ways that made the old narrative increasingly obsolete. The spring exhibition gained momentum. Boundaries attracted a surprising amount of press interest because the theme resonated deeply in a cultural moment where people were re-examining familial expectations, emotional labor, and self-definition. Collectors began reaching out directly. Commissions stacked onto my calendar in a way that forced me to hire a part-time assistant for editing and logistics. A young photography student named Maya, who reminded me painfully of my younger self, eager, undervalued, constantly apologizing for taking up space, and mentoring her became its own quiet form of healing. Teaching someone else to value their time and talent reinforced my own boundaries more deeply than any self-help book ever could. Meanwhile, my family dynamic continued, shifting in unpredictable ways. Megan's texts became less frequent, less emotionally charged, more neutral updates about the pregnancy, ultrasound photos, occasional logistical questions she mostly answered herself. And while the emotional closeness we once had wasn't there anymore, the transactional dependency had also loosened, which felt healthier even if it was less sentimental. My father continued sending brief but supportive emails every few weeks, articles about photography exhibitions, notes about conferences he attended, small gestures that suggested he was learning to engage with me as a person rather than a peripheral character in my mother's narrative, and my mother remained distant, but observant, occasionally liking posts from the gallery's social media page without commenting, a quiet form of monitoring that didn't go unnoticed. Then, just as the system seemed to settle into a new equilibrium, the real test arrived, not in the form of control, but in the form of vulnerability, genuine vulnerability this time, and that's what made it dangerous. It was a phone call late one evening, my mother's number flashing on the screen unexpectedly, and something in my gut told me this wasn't a strategic move. It was something else, something heavier, and when I answered, her voice sounded different, thinner, unsteady in a way I hadn't heard before. "Wendy," she said quietly, "I'm in the hospital." My stomach dropped instinctively, old protective wiring activating before logic could intervene. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "They found a mass," she said. "They're running tests." The word mass landed with unsettling ambiguity, and suddenly all the old narratives about control and manipulation felt less relevant in the face of raw mortality, because illness strips away performance and forces everyone into the same fragile human category. And in that moment, I wasn't the boundary-setting daughter or the invisible scapegoat. I was simply a daughter hearing her mother's fear through a phone line stretching across states. "Are you okay right now?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I'm scared." The silence between us carried years of unresolved history and unspoken tension, but also something more primal, vulnerability without armor. And for a brief moment, the old urge to drop everything and return surged up inside me. The reflex to rescue, to become the stabilizer again, to reinsert myself into the caretaker role that had defined my identity for so long. And I had to consciously slow myself down and separate compassion from self-abandonment, because boundaries don't disappear just because circumstances change. They adapt thoughtfully, not impulsively. "I'm really sorry you're going through this," I said honestly. "That's frightening." "I don't want to go through this alone," she whispered. And there it was, the emotional gravity of the request, the kind that doesn't come wrapped in manipulation, but in genuine fear. And the complexity of adulthood is learning how to respond to that without erasing yourself in the process. "You're not alone," I said carefully. "Dad is there. Megan is there. You have doctors and support. I can talk with you, check in with you, but I can't relocate right now." The pause on the other end was long and heavy. "I was hoping you'd come home," she said quietly, "just for a little while." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, honoring the sadness without surrendering the boundary. "I understand why you'd want that," I said gently, "and I care about you. But coming home would mean stepping back into dynamics that aren't healthy for me. I can support you in ways that don't compromise my stability." Another silence, then a small, almost resigned exhale. "I suppose you really have changed," she said, not accusing this time, but observing. "Yes," I replied softly. "I have." The call ended on a subdued, unresolved note, not warm, not hostile, just heavy with reality, and after I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time staring at the wall, allowing myself to feel the emotional complexity without rushing to fix or numb it. Grief for what never was, compassion for what now was, pride for holding my ground, sadness for the distance that remained, all coexisting without needing to cancel each other out, and that's when I realized how much emotional maturity had quietly grown inside me, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into old roles. Over the next weeks, updates trickled in, more tests, ambiguous results, cautious optimism. The mass was benign but required monitoring. Surgery was scheduled. Anxiety ebbed and flowed through the family like weather patterns, and I stayed present through calls, messages, emotional support. But I did not uproot my life or step back into operational responsibility, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it demonstrated that connection doesn't require self-erasure. And yet, even as that chapter stabilized, something else was unfolding quietly in the background that would bring everything to a sharper point, because when systems lose control over a member, they often attempt one final maneuver to reassert narrative dominance, not through force, but through public perception. And what I didn't yet know was that my mother had been speaking about me to extended family and church friends in a way that reframed my boundaries as abandonment, my independence as selfishness, and my distance as betrayal, shaping a story where she was the wounded matriarch and I was the ungrateful daughter who had disappeared when things got hard. And that story was about to surface in a way I couldn't ignore, not because it threatened my reputation, but because it would force a final, irreversible decision about how visible I was willing to be with my truth, and whether I would finally step fully into my own narrative instead of allowing others to write it for me. The first sign something was wrong came in the form of a message from a cousin I barely spoke to anymore, a name that hadn't lit up my phone in years, suddenly appearing on my screen one quiet Sunday afternoon while I was editing a commission piece, the ocean light shifting slowly across the studio floor as gulls cried somewhere beyond the windows. And at first I assumed it was a harmless check-in, the kind people send when they remember you exist during holidays or family gossip cycles, but the tone of the message immediately told me otherwise. "Hey Wendy, I hope you're okay. I heard from Aunt Patricia that you cut the family off and refused to come help when she was sick. I just wanted to make sure you're all right and not going through something." I stared at the screen, reading it twice, feeling the familiar heat of disbelief rise in my chest. Not anger exactly, but that hollow, disorienting sensation of watching reality get rewritten in real time by someone who had always been comfortable bending truth to fit their narrative. And what made it sting wasn't just the misrepresentation. It was the speed at which the story had traveled and mutated, the efficiency with which my mother had activated the extended network of sympathetic ears to reinforce her version of events, positioning herself as the wounded matriarch and me as the cold, selfish daughter who abandoned her in crisis. And suddenly the situation stopped being private emotional tension and became a public identity issue, because reputation, especially in tightly woven family and community systems, isn't just about ego, it's about how people treat you, trust you, and position you socially moving forward. And I realized in that moment that silence would now function as consent to the false story being told about me. I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the realization settle fully instead of reacting impulsively, because every instinct from my old life would have told me to explain myself privately, to smooth things over quietly, to avoid conflict, to absorb the distortion for the sake of peace. But that version of me no longer existed, and the decision in front of me wasn't about defending my ego, it was about whether I was willing to finally occupy my truth publicly, even if that made people uncomfortable. I opened the message thread and typed a response slowly, choosing clarity over defensiveness. I didn't cut the family off, and I didn't refuse to support anyone. I've stayed in contact, offered emotional support, and maintained boundaries that protect my stability. I didn't relocate or resume unpaid caregiving roles. If you have questions, I'm open to explaining directly rather than through secondhand stories. I hit send and exhaled, knowing that was only the first ripple in what would likely become a much larger wave. Over the next 2 days, more messages arrived, some concerned, some curious, some quietly judgmental, all echoing variations of the same distorted narrative. And instead of shrinking from it, I decided to address it head-on in the only place where I fully controlled the narrative, my own voice and platform, because over the past year my social presence had grown organically alongside my artistic career. The galleries, marketing, magazine coverage, interviews, behind-the-scenes content, all of it had created a modest but engaged audience of people who followed not just my photography, but my story of transformation and self-definition. And while I had always been careful not to overshare personal family dynamics publicly, I recognize now that selective transparency could serve not as revenge, but as truth correction and boundary reinforcement. That evening, I set up my camera in the studio, adjusted the lighting, took a deep breath, and recorded a video unlike any I had ever shared before, speaking directly, calmly, without bitterness or dramatization, explaining the concept of invisible labor, family scapegoating, and how boundaries sometimes look like abandonment to people who benefited from your overextension. I shared enough personal context to ground the message without naming individuals or sensationalizing pain, framing it as a universal pattern rather than a personal vendetta. And as I spoke, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet authority replacing the old fear of being misunderstood. Because once you accept that not everyone will approve of your truth, you become free to speak it clearly. I posted the video the next morning with a simple caption about choosing self-respect over silent compliance, and logged off for a few hours to avoid obsessing over reactions. When I checked back later, the response was overwhelming, hundreds of comments from people sharing eerily similar experiences, daughters, sons, caregivers, invisible siblings, people who had been framed as selfish the moment they stopped overfunctioning for others. The collective validation created a wave of solidarity that felt grounding rather than intoxicating, because it wasn't about being praised, it was about being accurately seen, and in that digital echo chamber of shared truth, the power of my mother's distorted narrative quietly began dissolving, not through confrontation, but through context. Predictably, the video reached its way back into family circles within hours, because information travels faster than intention ever anticipates. And that evening my phone rang again, my mother's name glowing on the screen. And I already knew this call would not be about health updates or reconciliation. It would be about narrative control. I answered calmly, grounding myself before speaking. "How could you do this to me?" she began immediately, her voice sharp with indignation and wounded pride. "You made me look like a monster in front of everyone." I paused, letting the emotional spike pass before responding. "I didn't name you or accuse you publicly," I said evenly. "I spoke about my own experience and boundaries." "Everyone knows it's about me," she snapped. "My friends are calling asking what happened in our family. You embarrassed me." There it was, the core issue laid bare, not the truth, not the relationship, not healing, but image management, the same priority structure that had shaped my childhood in subtle and overt ways, and for the first time I didn't feel compelled to soften the mirror. "I'm not responsible for protecting a false narrative," I replied. "I'm responsible for living honestly." She inhaled sharply, preparing a counterattack, but something unexpected happened instead. Her voice cracked, not performatively this time, but with genuine fatigue. "I gave everything to this family," she said quietly. "I sacrificed my whole life." I recognized the emotional truth beneath the defensiveness, the story she had lived inside for decades, a woman whose identity was fused with caretaking and control, who equated self-worth with indispensability and who experienced any boundary from others as existential rejection. And while I felt compassion for that wounded place, I also knew it was not mine to fix. "I believe you did what you thought was right," I said gently, "but your sacrifices don't entitle you to my autonomy." Silence stretched across the line. "So that's it," she finally said. "You've chosen strangers over your own mother." I closed my eyes briefly. "I've chosen myself," I said, "and healthy connection where it exists." The call ended without resolution, but also without explosion. A strange, quiet stalemate that felt more mature than any interaction we'd ever had before, because it was rooted in reality rather than emotional theatrics. In the weeks that followed, the external noise gradually settled, extended family conversations shifted, some people apologized for assumptions, some remained distant, some quietly recalibrated their understanding of me, and I learned to tolerate the ambiguity of partial acceptance without needing universal validation, which was its own milestone of emotional maturity. Meanwhile, my career continued accelerating in ways that felt both exhilarating and grounding. Boundaries sold out completely by the final week. A collector from San Francisco commissioned a large-scale installation piece. Marcus began discussing the possibility of National Gallery representation within the next 2 years, and Maya, my assistant, was accepted into a prestigious photography program, something she credited to the confidence and mentorship she'd gained working alongside me. And watching her step into her potential felt like a symbolic closure of my own invisible years, a generational shift away from quiet self-erasure toward visible self-trust. One evening, months later, as autumn softened the coastline and the cafe windows fogged with early evening chill, I sat alone in the studio reviewing old photographs, including some of the earliest invisible women images, and something struck me that I hadn't consciously articulated before. The series had never truly been about strangers. It had always been about me, about documenting invisibility in order to eventually escape it. And as I scrolled through the timeline of my own evolution, the progression from hiding to claiming space felt undeniable, not dramatic, not cinematic, but steady, intentional, earned. My phone buzzed again, another message from my cousin, the same one who had reached out initially. "I watched your video. I'm sorry I assumed anything. It actually helped me rethink some stuff in my own family. Thank you for sharing." I smiled softly at the screen, not because of vindication, but because truth, when spoken calmly and consistently, has a way of quietly rearranging the world around it without needing force. Later that night, I walked down to the beach alone, the tide rolling in rhythmically under a sky dusted with stars, the salty wind brushing against my face, and I thought about how different my life felt from even 2 years ago, not just externally, but internally. The absence of constant anticipatory anxiety, the quiet confidence of self-trust, the ability to say no without guilt, the capacity to hold compassion without self-sacrifice, and I realized that revenge had never been the point, not proving them wrong, not public humiliation, not dominance, but liberation, the slow, layered process of disentangling from narratives that were never mine to carry in the first place. If there is a deeper lesson embedded in this story, it's that betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in small assumptions, unspoken roles, invisible expectations that quietly hollow out identity over time. And healing doesn't always look like confrontation or dramatic closure. Sometimes it looks like building a life so aligned with your truth that the old distortions simply can't survive in its presence. And as I stood there listening to the ocean, I felt grateful not for the pain that shaped me, but for the resilience and clarity that emerged from choosing myself consistently, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it disrupted narratives, even when it forced others to see me differently. And the strange thing is, the more solid my own foundation became, the less I needed external validation or reconciliation to feel complete. The peace came from internal coherence, from knowing who I am, what I value, what I will and will not tolerate, and that quiet stability became its own reward. As I turned back toward the studio lights glowing faintly in the distance, I realized that the story didn't actually end here. It simply continued evolving into new chapters of growth, creative risk, mentorship, deeper relationships chosen intentionally rather than inherited automatically. And the next chapter was already forming in ways I couldn't fully predict yet, a larger exhibition proposal, a collaborative project with Marcus that could bring my work into an international space. Opportunities that once would have felt unreachable, but now simply felt like natural extensions of who I had become. And as with every meaningful transition before it, the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to consciously shape, one boundary, one choice, one honest moment at a time, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind me, no longer steering the direction of my life, only informing the strength of the path I continued walking forward.